Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, it's part 3 of our road grader build. When we finished up on last week's show, we had made some great progress with a little bit of assembly with our engine block and the pieces that come below it, including those great looking toolboxes. But this week, we're going to start continuing on page 3 with our lower cylinder mount. The lower cylinder mount is a very easy piece to make with very geometric shapes that are very quickly converted and transferred onto a block of wood. So I have cut our stock 1/2 inch thick to its final dimensions of 7/8 by 4 1/8, and scaling off of the drawing, I'm just going to transfer our marks, sand up to the lines at the sander, and drill our holes. One thing to note is that the radius on the top corners of this piece, the radius are 3/8 of an inch, or you can use a 3/4 inch circle template. Well, the next pieces I'm going to concentrate on are going to be our blade mounts. Now we need to make one right and left. So what determines the right and the left? Because the patterns are the same. Well, what determines it is this curve right here. On the outside of each one of these blade mounts, it will be curved. So depending on what side you put the curve on, that will make it the right or the left. So what I have done is I've taken the pattern and I have photocopied both the top profile with the curve and our side profiles. And basically I have placed the top profile onto a piece of 1/4 inch MDF. I have cut it out and sanded up to the line to make a marking template. For these ones here, I have photocopied the patterns and I have cut the stock 3/8 of an inch thick to their final dimensions, coated the wood with masking tape, and then using spray adhesive, I've placed our patterns onto our blocks. So now we're going to take them both and put them upright because we want to mark that curve pattern so that we don't get confused. Now the curve goes on the tail end of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this template right here, line it up with the edges, and we're going to mark that curve on one of our pieces. And then we're going to, on the opposite piece, we're going to flip this over, our template, to make it face the opposite way. We're going to line up our edges just like this, and just like we did on the first one, we're going to mark our profile. Now those profiles are going to be the very first thing that we do. However, you want to be a little bit careful. Doing this over at the belt sander is not the safest operation. There's not enough material to get you away from that belt. So I've taken a scrap block, cut off one square edge, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use double-sided tape, and we're going to attach our pieces to this block, and from there we're going to shape this profile. Now you don't need a lot of tape, and I'm actually placing the tape in the waist area of the pattern. So should it tear away the pattern when I separate it from this block, it's not going to damage where I need to cut the rest of it. However, just pushing this like this on here and letting it sit there isn't going to get a good adhesion. You want to put it on the block, clamp it up, and now let that sit for 2 or 3 minutes to get a really good adhesion onto your scrap block. And now using the scrap block as a holder or a handle, you can get your fingers far enough away from that sanding belt to be able to shape the side profile of this piece, no problem, with no danger to your fingers. Guys, let me tell you from personal experience, these sanding belts can be just as dangerous to your hands as what a table saw blade can. Believe it or not, I have had it where it has hooked my hands and smashed my hands down to the table. It caused serious damage, and there's a reason I keep my fingers away from the belt now. And with that sanded, we can carefully peel this off of here, hoping not to damage the pattern. It's sticking terribly to the pattern. We're gonna have a problem. Okay, it did pull the pattern off, but I think I can reposition it. Not an issue. So we're gonna very carefully lay this back out on here as carefully as we can. Look at that. No harm, no foul. Pattern is right back on there. It's secure and lined up. So we can now take this over to the scroll saw and cut the perimeter of our brackets. Now on your other piece, what is going to happen because of the way that you're sanding and doing left and right, you are actually going to sand off this one end of your pattern. That's not a problem. There will be enough left of your line here that you can measure down and extend it along to make your cut. Or if you prefer, you can cut this line here first, just past where you're going to sand, and that will avoid any issues with having to draw on that curved space. And after a light sanding, we have both our left and our right blade mounts completed. So we can put those aside, and we're now going to concentrate on our hose covers. Again, we need to make right and left covers. So I have some 1/4 inch thick stock here. I have coated it in masking tape and then applied the pattern with spray adhesive. The very first step that I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut these out over at the scroll saw. And what you end up with is a couple pieces like this, but this isn't the difficult part. The problem with this piece starts off with this chamfer that they show here on the drawing. And while I have 1,000,001 tools to cut that chamfer, not a single one of them are safe enough for me to do with pieces this small. It's a great way to lose a finger if you want to give it a try. So this is what I'm going to do. It's a little old school, but it works. I have gone all the way around the perimeter of each one of these pieces, making sure that I have a left and a right, and I have marked a line 1/8 of an inch in from each edge and parallel to that edge. I have then taken some sandpaper, 180 grit. I have mounted it to a 3/4 inch piece of MDF and then cut it here at a 45-degree angle. And what that does essentially is by riding this on the 45-degree angle, I am now able to run this along our piece, just like this on a flat surface. And eventually, if I sand up to that line, I will get that 45-degree chamfer. And there we go. There is one of the 45 chamfers done. So I'm going to go around the entire piece. It's going to be a little tedious in here in this corner, but we'll get it done. And I'm going to go all the way around and chamfer all of the edges to complete these pieces using our homemade 45-degree chamfer file. Well, it took about a half an hour to file down or sand down these chamfers to get them the way that I like them, but I'm happy with the results. It was done safely, and it cost me all of a little bit of 3/4 MDF and a little strip of sandpaper. So there you go. Think outside the box, guys, but also think safe when you're trying to make these smaller parts. Well, the next piece that I want to make is going to be the pivot block, which also happens to be the last piece on sheet 3. And for that, we need a piece of 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch stock. And I've cut this from scrap. I actually cut this at the table saw, ripping it 3/4 by 3/4. And then I cut off a piece here, 3/4 of an inch long on the outside of the blade. In other words, this was my offcut, not the part that was attached to the fence. So the first thing that I want to do is in the end grain here, I've marked the center point, and I want to drill a 3/8 diameter hole that is 9/16 of an inch deep. Well, the drawing here shows a little bit of a countersink here, and you can do this with a twist bit if you'd like. Why don't you just drill it with a twist bit in the first place? I find they like to grab, and when they grab, they're going to take this piece, and this piece will be junk. So now at this point, we are going to measure from the side with our hole in it up 3/16 of an inch, and then in from one edge at 3/16 of an inch, and we will drill a 1/8 diameter through hole all the way through our piece. Now you want to drill slowly because it's actually going to break into this 3/8 diameter hole. And when it does that, you don't want to cause any deflection. So just drill straight through and you'll be fine. I may avoid the entire problem or issue of deflection by putting a small little scrap of 3/8 diameter dowel in here to give something for the bit to bite into. And truth be told, that is exactly what I did. A little piece of 3/8 dowel jammed in the hole will allow the bit to travel straight through. And we'll just verify the measurements on this side. Yes, 3/16 and 3/16 to center. It's right on the money. So that did exactly what I was hoping it was going to do. So at this point now, there is, I guess we'll call it a dado that we need to cut into this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark it out where I want to cut it. And believe it or not, I'm going to cut it carefully at the scroll saw. And that would be it for the pivot block. Not a difficult piece, just one that you really need to think about your procedure because of its size and keep safety in mind. If you are going to take chances on the table saw with cutting a piece like this, that sort of thing, guys, if you lose a finger, you're not doing any woodworking. So please keep safety in mind and just think through the procedure of it and you'll be just fine. That piece worked out really great. Well, I now want to make the front axle block 2, which is on sheet 4 of the plans. So the first thing we're going to do is I have cut the 3/4 inch thick stock to the finished dimensions, and there are 3 holes to drill. We have this one here in the front. We also have 2 in the top section, which we are going to scale off the drawings and mark them out. They are all 3/16 of an inch in diameter, and they're all through holes. So we'll get those 3 holes done first, and then we can move on to the next step. With those holes drilled, we can now cut our angles on our front axle. And we can see here by the drawing that at the back we have 2 angles. At the back of the axle, it is cut at a 45 degree. At the front of the axle, it is cut at a 46.5 degree. So we'll just measure off the drawing, scale it off, set our miter fence at the table saw, and we will cut these angles on our front axle. Now at this point, before I cut the 46.5 degree angle, I have taken this over to the scroll saw and I have cut these straight lines in here just past our mark for our angle that we're going to cut. That way I don't need to try to replace the lines there to cut them later. So we're going to set this up and cut those 46.5 degree angles, and I'll show you what we have at that point. And we can just verify this against the drawing or against the plans to make sure that those angles were cut correctly and in the right spot. And then we're going to take this over to the scroll saw and cut the rest of the design out. And I'll show you what we've got once I get that cut. And with some careful cutting, this is what you end up with. And of course, you can always hold it up to the drawing and verify that it's the way that it should be. The scroll saw is, for me anyway, a very important part of any of these models, guys. But I'd just like to point out, if you don't have a scroll saw, the bandsaw is a very capable substitution. as our hand tools. So don't think that if you don't have a scroll saw, you can't make one of these models. So with this being done now, I think I'm going to do the rear linkage. Now guys, the rear linkage is the exact same process that I just showed you. It's really not rocket science here. We're going to drill the holes first and then cut out the slots and shape this thing. Honestly guys, I don't think we need a video of this because it's the exact same process as what we just did with the front axle block. The only difference is instead of cutting angles at the table saw, we will be shaping it at the belt sander. Well, at this point, I'm a little bit confused. We have this front axle number 1 from sheet 3 and this front axle number 2 from sheet 4. Now, I cannot find anywhere on the plans, maybe I'm missing something, but I can't see anywhere where it shows why we have 2 front axles. But what I can figure is that they're giving you options. This one here from sheet 3 is the most basic axle where it will not, it will just have fixed wheelbase on the front end that will pivot side to side to allow for the road variances, but it is just straight running wheels. Whereas this one from page 4 will allow for steering in the front end. Well, why would you just want fixed wheels? Get rid of that. Get that off my show. Anyway, if you want the fixed wheels, that's just fine. At least you know that how to make that piece, but just to let you know, if you want an option, there apparently is one here to go for steering wheels in the front or non-steering wheels in the front. We're going to go for the steering as we've already made most of the parts. So that'll bring us to our next pieces that we want to make, and that will be our axle holders. Well, the very first thing I have done for the axle holders is to cut my blank. Now the blank, right from the plans, 2 1/8 inches long, 3/4 of an inch by 5/8 of an inch. So I cut these blocks over at the table saw, very easily done. And the first thing that I've done is mark a center line on both planes and mark the center points of our holes. Now, while there is no center marks on these holes, they're very easy to measure off of the plans. This one's 3/4 of an inch in from the end, this one is 3/8 of an inch in from the end, and this one here is 3/8 of an inch in from the end. The only way that I'm going to deviate from drilling these holes is that instead of a 5/16 diameter hole, I've said it before, I'll say it again, this is going to be a 1/4 inch because I do things differently. Let me explain so that you can decide what size holes you want to drill. I do not use the axle pins that they call for. All of my wheels are turned on the lathe, and when I turn them I use a penman drill which has a 1/4 inch center, which means that all of my wheels have a 1/4 inch hole. If the hole that I'm drilling for the axles is for a solid axle, I drill it at the 5/16 and I use a 1/4 inch axle to connect my wheels. That way that 1/4 inch axle has room to turn inside the 5/16 of an inch hole. However, if it is not a through axle, which is the case for these axle holders here, I like to drill the 1/4 inch hole of the wheel just a little bit larger, and then I use a 1/4 inch pin that I make to solidify it here into this little axle holder. So you can decide, I hope that made sense to you, you can decide what size holes you want to drill and the methods that you want to use. But either way, we're going to get these holes drilled. Well, the next step is to transfer both your curve at this end, which is done with a 3/4 diameter circle template, and as well, you want to transfer the marks for your rabbets here on this side. Now, this curve will be done over at the belt sander, but before you do that, I would suggest cutting these lines here just back beyond where your arch is going to end. That way you don't have to mess around, just like I've said before, with trying to transfer lines around the curve. So I'm going to get these cut, going to get this shaped, and then I will show you what we end up with. And with the axle holders made, we can do a dry fit of the steering assembly. So you'll need the front axle block, number 2, not your solid axle, and you'll also need your rear linkage. So basically, you just want to make sure that these pieces fit and that they'll move in there. Now that's a little tight the way that one went in there. I may do some light sanding and just loosen it up a little bit. But essentially, your steering will sit like this. Now, that brings me to the next part that I want to make, and that will be the axle holder pins. Now, any pins, including ones that hold wheels, I make in the exact same way. So you can consider this next segment as your tutorial for the rest of the build on how to make these pins. Well, in order to make these pins, for starters, I've placed a 3/16 drill bit here in the drill press, and I have set a depth stop so that it will drill pretty much as deep as it will let me without punching through. I've then set my fence here. I just have a scrap of walnut. It is absolutely nothing special. In fact, it's pretty much a piece of junk. And I am going to drill these 3/8 diameter holes roughly about an inch apart. Now, I've set my fence to drill pretty much, it's a rough guesstimate, pretty much in the middle of our scrap here. Now, without changing any of the fence settings or anything else, I'm going to remove the 3/16 diameter drill bit and I will place in a 3/8 inch plug cutter. Now I have raised up our work surface with a scrap of wood. We're going to place our walnut up against the fence, and then using the plug cutter centered on our hole, we're going to drill until the plug releases. And that is step 1. So do that for the rest of the holes, and then I'll see you over at the bench. Well, the next thing you want to do is I've got some pieces of 3/16 diameter dowel. I've cut them to be 1 1/4 inches long, which is longer than what I need for this front steering assembly, but I prefer to make them longer and then cut them to length. So we're going to place a little bit of glue here in this 3/16 diameter hole that we drilled in our kind of plug section, and we will glue dowels into each one of these, just like that. And at this point now, we're going to clean up any squeeze out that came out of this, and you need to let these completely dry. So put them aside and go do something else. And when they're completely dry, come back and see me. Well, for me, once the glue is dried, it's time to shape the end. This section up here that we drilled, the plug. And I just very gently, don't crank on it because you'll damage that piece of maple there or the dowel. So we just gently put it there in the chuck of our drill and turn the drill on and use a piece of sandpaper to shape the end. Now these are much larger, they have a much larger head and they're much longer than what the plans call for, but I actually prefer that, and that way when you place them into your model or your build where they need to be, it's very easy now. Place this in here, we can mark it at the bottom and then cut them at our miter box and you will have custom pins made. And honestly, they look great, they work really well, and they're so easy to make, guys, honestly. So there you go. That is how I make my retaining pins for the build and my axle pins. Every single one is made the exact same way. Okay, and there is our front steering assembly done. We can see how those front wheels now will turn together. And it's much better than a solid axle, but it's all your preference, whatever you like to do. All right, so we'll just give this a light sanding around to take off any areas that I missed and clean it up a little. And then that's that section done. And once again, unfortunately, we've run out of time on today's show. There's still plenty more to go on this, guys, and hopefully you have found what I've brought you so far up here until part 3 useful, and it's helped you along in being able to make a successful model of your own. Now, guys, there's something that I'd like to point out. The laser engraving that I have done on this, both on the toolboxes and on the engine block, I also intend on doing a few other things. For that and my laser engravers, I use Lightburn as the software. Now, if you have a laser engraver and you are using Lightburn and you want to add the embellishments that I have put together and put on my model, by all means, send me an email at kennye@acutabovewoodworkings.com, and I would be more than happy to share my burn files with you. I mean, it took me a while to put them together and figure them out, but there's no reason we can't share them, and that way you guys can have successful laser burns on your models as well. So if you want those light burn patterns, by all means, shoot me a message. I'd love to send them to you. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. You click that bell and then you're not going to miss the notifications of future episodes of the show. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you found it useful. If not useful, I hope you found it informative. If not informative, I hope you found it entertaining. I hope you're going to try this for yourself, guys. And more importantly, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.